Welcome to The Hidden Truth, Breaking the Silence. I'm your host, Jonathan McLernan. Each episode, we explore stories of individuals and how they've been affected by being a part of a secretive Christian fellowship. The stories shared here may include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Dysfunction happens when doctrine meets dogma and silence is paramount. So let's pull back the veil on today's episode of The Hidden Truth. All right, welcome back. For those who've been following along, I've actually had a bit of a hiatus from publishing episodes after overcoming some bronchitis. And so I'm actually really looking forward to this interview. It's the first one back for a while. So I'm also excited to bring Megan onto the show. I had the pleasure of interviewing Megan previously for my other podcast, Between Before and After, and I thought she had such a remarkable story, but it was also very relevant to what we're trying to expose and bring attention to over here in this show. So I wanted to bring Megan on and have her share her story here as well. So welcome to the show, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before we dive into it, maybe let's let people know where you're at right now and kind of what you're currently doing, and then we're going to explore the backstory.
Yeah, so most of my work right now is coaching other people through traumatic experiences and leaving high demand religions and exiting other sort of abusive situations. And it's really fulfilling for me. I'm really enjoying doing that work and just getting out there on social media and trying to spread the word that healing is possible and that life after trauma can be beautiful.
I love that. And I think it's a super, super important message because there's so many people out there that are struggling. You used a really key phrase there, high demand religions. And you've had a lot of experience with this yourself. I'm curious how you would define a high demand religion, and maybe sharing a little bit about how you feel that affects people and creates trauma.
Yeah, so high demand religion is not my phrase. I can't take credit for that. I've heard it in the ex-Mormon space for a long time. And I think it's a little bit more of a kind way to talk about cultish behavior and to talk about high control groups. A lot of people don't like the cult word. They find it offensive. But it really is a way to describe, certain groups that really demand a lot of their members, and they take a lot of space in the members' lives. So they try to control, for example, the things that you wear, the things that you eat and drink, who you marry. They try to control the amount of information that you consume. They try to limit the information that you consume, so it's only from approved sources. And they may try to manipulate your emotions in some way to get you dependent on the religion or the group or the organization. And so I think it's just a way of encompassing, talking about all of these different groups that kind of fall on the spectrum of culty.
Yeah, I like that you said there's a kind of a spectrum for this, because I think that also softens the word cult. Nobody wants to put up their hand and say, like, I was deceived and maybe brought up in a cult. And there are, I think, some researchers who've tried to create a fairly definitive definition of what qualifies as a cult. But I really think there is kind of a spectrum, like everything else. And maybe this is why people have also some degree of discomfort with this, because it's like, well, I don't feel like I was sort of brainwashed into this, or I was trapped in this, or things like that. But when you start to look at patterns of behavior that emerge over time, you think, wow, this is starting to tick a lot of boxes. You mentioned the Mormon Church, and I know that you were raised in the Mormon Church and you spent a number of years in the Mormon Church. I'd be curious if you feel comfortable sharing, what other like groups have you encountered that sort of fit this kind of definition that you were describing there?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because after leaving the church, I actually did a course with a researcher whose name is, now it just left my mind. He wrote a book called Cults to Consciousness, and it's Dr. Stephen Hassan. And he was in the Moonies cult back in the 60s and 70s. And he wasn't in for that long, but that was the time frame that cult was popular. It was like the mass weddings. And after finally being able to break free, he spent the rest of his career dedicating himself to researching cults and cult behavior. And he came up with something called the BITE model. for determining where something is on the spectrum of healthy versus unhealthy. And one of the things that he talks about is the fact that cults are all around us. There's a cult of Diet Coke drinkers. There's a cult of Apple
Right.
product consumers. There's a cult of Taylor Swift fans. There's a cult
Yeah.
of Trump supporters. It's all of these different groups fall on that spectrum somewhere. And
Mhm,
he
mhm.
uses what he calls the bite model to make definitions about whether the cult that you're in is healthy or not healthy. It can even be a work environment, the corporation that you work for,
Right.
any sports team that you follow, those kinds of things. So BITE, BITE, stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion.
Mhm.
And if you belong to a group that are trying to manipulate or control any one of those four areas, it could be on the unhealthy side of the spectrum.
Mhm. That's fascinating. And I like that, you mentioned how many different ways, like, cults can kind of show up in our society. I think of, like, sometimes movies or books, they get referred to as developing a cult following,
Mhm.
and that's actually almost seen like a positive thing.
Yeah.
Maybe like, Star Trek and Star Wars, probably you could say that they have a cult following. But they're like really, really big. There's also some more obscure things that maybe they didn't make it big at the box office or something like that, but then they sort of build some kind of following afterwards. I think it really points to some interesting facets of just human behavior in general, and our desire to belong and to find some kind of sense of meaning. And I'm thinking, I wonder if, like, not all things that fall in the spectrum are entirely a bad thing, and maybe this is why people experience cognitive dissonance around this, because they think, well, how is it a bad thing when I'm getting some good things out of this? And have you encountered any sort of cults or groups that are exclusively negative, or do you think it's this idea that it can be really hard to break free because you are getting something positive out of the experience? Just as a whole, it's a negative thing. Would that be why some people struggle so much with trying to break free from this?
Yeah, I think what you said is spot on, that people join groups for all sorts of different reasons, but the main feeling that we get is a sense of belonging, a sense of
Hmm.
community, sometimes even a sense of validation. And I think one of the reasons why these groups are so compelling is because there's sort of a list of unwritten rules that if you match these qualifications or if you check these boxes, that you're automatically going to be accepted. And so, it's one of these where it's a lot easier for us to look outward for validation from external sources than it is to look inward and love and accept ourselves. And
Hmm.
that work of loving and accepting ourselves is a lot harder than going to a Taylor Swift concert and dressing like everybody else and singing along with the lyrics and feeling like you really belong somewhere with thousands of other people. It's such a quick high.
Yeah, yeah. What do they call them? Do they call them like Swifties or something like
Swifties.
that?
Yeah,
Right.
and I have to talk about it lovingly because my couple of my daughters are Swifties, so
Right, right. I think it's such a that in itself is such a fascinating cultural phenomenon, because there's like, I think there's kind of a fake, I don't want to say a fake story behind it. Like, oh, like came from nothing. It's like, well, that's not it's not quite true when you actually look at the backstory. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of genius marketing that goes into that. And
Mhm.
so, and then I think about how, bring this back to sort of this idea of religious groups and these high control groups and high demand groups. It seems like there are certain types of individuals that are drawn to being in leadership positions within these. We would all see this in the corporate world, but what are some sort of really unhealthy behaviors that you would tend to observe from religious leadership?
Well, it's a really tricky thing being in religious leadership because you are given a certain degree of power and control
Hmm.
over people. And you're also given the opportunity to manipulate people spiritually and to abuse people spiritually, and also to have access to potential other abuse victims. And so it can be a really tricky thing where you may get into leadership, church leadership, because you want to do good and make a difference. But sometimes the power and control that you have corrupts you and you start using it against people without even really knowing it. And I don't know about a lot of other high demand, high control religions, but I know that the one of the things in the Mormon church that has become unhealthy on a lot of levels is the idea that your ecclesiastical leader has some power over what jobs you get in the church or what groups you're accepted into in the church. And for Mormons, the pinnacle of Mormon worship is to go to the Mormon temple, and you have to go through a two-step interview process in order to get acceptance into the temple. And they give you a card, and you literally have to take it with you to the temple, and they scan your barcode, and you have to have
Wow.
two different church authorities sign off on that. So, if those men don't like the way that you answer the questions, then they can prevent you from going to the highest level of worship. And the temple is where people get married. So they can prevent you from getting married. They can prevent you from attending the wedding of your own child if they don't like the way that you answer the questions. So it really does become a powerful position where there's a
Mhm.
lot of cultural and social power as well as spiritual power. So I think it's a hard thing to ask human beings to be in a leadership position that has that much power over people and expect it to not create some corruption in the wrong kinds of people.
Right, right. I wrote down a phrase. It's an older phrase from politics, but it's called the party clobbering machine, and it's kind of an expression that refers to when somebody goes into politics and they have all of these great ideals. They're young, they're energetic, they're excited, they're going to make change, they're going to be a part of reform, and there's all these great things they want to accomplish. And then along comes the party clobbering machine. And basically, by the time they're done, they've just fallen in line with whatever it is the party does. And they've really kind of lost themselves in their sense of individual identity, becoming a part of that party. And so you're right. There probably are a good many people who find themselves gravitating towards leadership positions within religious organizations who have good intentions, but once you get in there, something happens, and it could be a product of the structure and the hierarchy itself, that sort of facilitates this kind of spiritual abuse. Or there's probably also a combination of the people that find themselves in positions of power and how they kind of handpick their successors as well. There's sort of human hierarchy that develops. Do you tend to observe if it's more a systematic thing versus a human thing, or how do those two kind of wrap together?
It's probably a complicated, number of factors that come together, but also what you're mentioning about the party clobbering machine, is reminding me a lot of the corporation of the church. The Church of
Hmm.
Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is literally a corporation. There are two separate corporations, and I won't get into the structure of that, but the entire focus of the corporation is to keep the reputation of the corporation pristine. And
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
even to the point where bishops, the bishops are the ones who they're leaders of a congregation. So it would be like a pastor
Right. Yeah.
in any other church. And people will come to the bishop and confess their sins. And if somebody confesses to, for example, some kind of abuse, the bishop has a hotline that he can call where the church corporation tells him how to handle this confession. And it's not a hotline to a mental health professional. It's not a hotline to even a human resources professional. It's a hotline to a law firm, the law firm that
Hmm.
represents the church. And it's not to get help for the victim or the confessor. It's so that the bishop doesn't report it in a way that makes the church look bad or that gets the church into legal trouble. And so when you're the leader of a congregation, but you're answering to a corporation and to a law firm, that's a very problematic kind of structure to have in place when you're talking about, people confessing, abusing children and things like that.
It's funny you mentioned that. Obviously, the organization that I'm a part of is much smaller, I think, in scope and scale than the LDS Church. But maintaining a pristine image, this is a thing I think almost above all else that really facilitates the cover up of abuse. There's this idea, like I imagine the Mormon temple. I guess there's only one, or there's one big one or one main one.
There
But
are hundreds of them actually.
okay. So shows you how much I know. I was thinking there must be like a head or a big church somewhere in Salt Lake City or something that's like the main one or the
Yeah.
whatever. But and imagine it's like very pristine and white and there's this whole image of purity that's like all wrapped up on the interior of this. And there's this beautiful awe-inspiring design and architecture and all of this. And there's this whole image that's created. And then somebody comes along and tells a story that's kind of akin to flinging a bucket of mud on the wall. And they're more concerned about scrubbing the mud off the wall than they are dealing with like the source of the mud. And it's this idea of trying to maintain this pristine image. And for what? For what?
Yeah,
Why do we have to
exactly.
maintain this pristine image?
Yeah, and I think for the Mormon church, the answer to that is to retain members at all costs because they're tithe-paying members, and it's a huge financial outlay as
Right.
well. So, but what something that you mentioned, makes me think the pristine image, well, it's no different than a family system who keeps secrets. And we
Mm,
talked about some of that on the other episode that I did, the maintaining that pristine image for what? So that the neighbors don't know that there's dysfunction in your family like there is in every single family in the existence of everything, it's just this sort of
yeah.
it's a false sense of security. And I think there's far more power in admitting shortcomings within the organization and doing your best to fix them. I think that would retain members a lot better than trying to cover up the fact that these things happen because we know they happen. We
Right.
just don't know the scale on which they're happening because of all of the
Yeah.
cover-ups. But then when something does come out and get exposed, I think that does far more damage than it would if you were just proactive about saying, "This thing happened, it was terrible. This is how we tried to help the victims."
It's interesting. My dad has referenced because I've had a lot of conversations with my dad about this. He's a part of this fellowship as well, and he talked about I think it would have been like the mid '90s. There was a Tylenol scandal in New York where somebody had been going and I think they were like using a needle to inject I don't know some kind of poison or they were basically tainting bottles of Tylenol in some way.
Mhm.
And the response was they went and just cleaned the shelves of everything. They recalled every bottle of Tylenol in like all of New York City kind of thing. And within, a day or two, there was somebody on there saying, we're absolutely going to take care of it. This has happened. We're taking every step we can to mitigate this, to reduce the risk. We've taken everything off the shelf and we're putting these procedures in place to make sure that this can never happen again. And I'm not suggesting that Tylenol is a great product. It's a useful product. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't have value, but I have my own opinion about pharmaceuticals. But how they handled that crisis is really a lesson in like what works. Because nowadays, does anyone even think about it?
Yeah.
Does anyone even remember that there was this crisis? No, because they said this happened. They didn't try to hide it or sweep it under the rug or somehow save money by keeping product on the shelf and taking the risk and so on and so forth. They went and they addressed it head on. And I think what a difference it would be if leadership in these organizations would stand up and say, there's this terrible thing that's been taking place. And it's been facilitated by our belief structure, by our hierarchy. There's all these reasons why this has been taking place. And we're terribly, terribly distressed by this. And we have to fix it. We have to make this right. And here's what we're going to do. In sort of Christian terminology, I might say like, sackcloth and ashes repentance, mourning, like actually coming out. And this is the thing that I think has a lot of people frustrated is when something like this is revealed, that this doesn't even show up. I think like, why are you more concerned about sweeping things under the carpet than about making things right? Because isn't that what this whole thing was supposed to be about?
Yeah, exactly. And, if you think about the hypocrisy to me, at least, of, a church like the LDS church that bears the name of the Savior, and think of the values that Jesus Christ presented.
Hmm.
And then you compare that with the way that the church organization looks and feels and operates and the sort of messages that they put out, it doesn't jive. And what's interesting is that everybody in the world seems to see it except for the people who are in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I think this is a fascinating one too, because there's a part of us that doesn't want to see this. So I would estimate in the 2x2 fellowship, as we're often referred to by outsiders, probably good 80% of congregants either don't know what has taken place or don't want to know what has taken place. And I'm a student of psychology and human behavior, and so I get curious about this and I go, why do people not want to know? And I think about their sense of identity and how it's tied up in this. And I go, okay, well, what do they feel is threatened by this knowledge or this information? Now, with leadership, it's fairly obvious. Your position, your access to money, your prestige, all of this is threatened. But to the average like layperson, congregant, or whatever, like what is threatened? It's like your very sense of identity. Because if you've been indoctrinated in a certain way that this is the way, and outside of this way, you're facing eternal damnation. So I don't want to know. And that actually really facilitates the furthering of abuse as well. And so I wonder if that's, I mean, I'm going to imagine it's probably the same in the LDS church, where a lot of people, maybe they just don't want to know, because they say, you will undermine my faith if you tell me that this is happening. And I think, well, what's your faith in?
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a complicated system for people who've been in the church for their entire lives, because telling somebody the truth about the doctrine being false, it does threaten their sense of self, but it also would cause them to have to admit that they have invested their entire lives into
Yes.
something that's not true. And that's incredibly damaging to one's ego. It's not only
Mhm.
that, though, it's this question of, well, if this isn't true, then what is?
Yes.
And there is this tendency to want to outsource our critical thinking,
Hmm.
because it's much easier to believe that my parents and my grandparents and all the leadership of the church and all the rest of my family members had it right, and to trust
Hmm.
those people and to just believe that they had it right. In order to question that, you really have to question everything. You have to say, well, is it possible that somebody way back down the line, can I point?
Yeah.
Right there.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
My grandmother, who I love very much, was, a
Mm-mm.
third generation Mormon, and so that makes me what, fifth generation, my
Yeah.
children sixth generation. And, for my children to be brave enough to question it and to say, "I don't know if this is right," and
Hmm. Hmm.
the other facet of that is, having limited information and having the church literally tell you that if you are a good, faithful member, you're not going to question anything that the church leadership says. And if you do question, it's because you have evil intentions. And also, everything that's written about the church that's not approved by the church leadership is evil and wrong and anti-Mormon literature, and you shouldn't read it. And also telling you that people who've left the church are evil and none of them are happy. And you can see that the light has left their eyes. And also the leadership of the church giving talks from the pulpit that say, if you leave us, where will you go? What will you do? And I have to say that it's very much true in Utah, where the population of Mormonism is so high. If you
Hmm.
leave the church there, and you're a doctor or a dentist or an attorney or a realtor, and your entire client base is church members, because
Hmm.
Mormons like to do business with other Mormons. They trust each other,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you leave the church, there goes your entire business as well. There goes your social circle. Your kids' friends are not allowed to come to your house anymore, because you get labeled as the nasty ex-Mormon, and so there is a huge amount at stake. And so psychologically, it's a really difficult thing to even confront the fact that what you believe might not be true. And it takes a
Mm.
great deal of courage to go ahead and open that internet browser and search for something that you've had questions about, knowing that you're probably going to come across things that you're not going to like or you're not going to want to hear. And it's confronting your own mortality, it's confronting your own
Mm.
existential crisis, it's confronting the entire system that you've been raised under and lived under for your whole life. So it is really hard. It's a lot easier to stay in, stay quiet, keep your head down, toe the line, believe what you've been taught. But for a lot of us who leave, I think we get to the point where that cognitive dissonance gets to be too much to manage, and we can't
Yeah.
handle it anymore.
Yeah.
There's a very famous talk in Mormonism one of the women leaders gave back in the 80s, where she said, if you don't understand something, or if doctrine doesn't make sense, or you don't feel like you're getting the answers that you need, just put it on your shelf. Just put it on the shelf and leave it there, and know that at some point your question's going to get answered, even if it's not in this life, even if it's in the afterlife, and you have to wait to ask God, why this, why that.
Mhm.
And so a really common phrase among post-Mormons is that my shelf broke because there were so many things on my shelf, it couldn't bear the weight anymore, and it just broke. And I think that's the point that a lot of us get to, where our cognitive dissonance outweighs the discomfort of leaving or questioning.
Isn't that just an encapsulation of like human psychology, that we don't change until the discomfort of remaining the same becomes greater than the discomfort of change?
Exactly.
And I find myself smiling kind of sardonically because I'm like, man, I'm hearing a lot of parallels here.
Yeah.
Because we're a relatively unknown organization, for the most part, small, probably, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000 congregants worldwide, like not very many people, and it'd been around for 125 years, kind of thing. And I think even started with good intentions. Let's try to model what we saw in the New Testament. Let's see if we can sort of recreate that. But it's become this thing where it became more and more insular. I don't know if that happens in the churches, the LDS church as well, where things just become more and more insular. And I know in this fellowship, it became more about like flock maintenance, I would call it, like trying to just keep this inner circle like closed off, than about like connecting with other people. And I think, man, if we think we have something of value, like why aren't we like going out and connecting with people? And why are we so afraid of people that don't look like us and don't act like us and behave like us? Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
definitely see parallels there for sure.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your story and your experience, and for those who want to hear like a more in depth version of it, there is the previous interview with Megan is available where there's more in depth in there. But I want to kind of loop it back in because I think there's also a buzzword that's been floating around a lot lately. Maybe the buzzword of the year has been like deconstruction and what that journey looks like. But if we could just sort of get a condensed version of your story of what you experienced, of the trauma that you went through, and how you kind of tried to navigate your way out of that. And then it's like all the roadblocks you kind of experienced because of how you've been taught, or dare I say, respectfully indoctrinated in what it was, that made it really difficult for you to recover. And so, kind of just opening the floor here.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely, indoctrination is the right word. And I will try to keep it brief, and please feel free to interrupt me if you think I need to go down in a different direction. I'll try to be as quick
Yeah,
as I can, because I could talk about this story for a really long time because it was my whole life. But,
and you've written some great books as well. I'll just mention that too, and we'll we'll mention them again afterwards, because I think people who really want to know, that they're well worth reading. So,
oh, thank
um,
you.
yeah.
So like I said, fifth generation Mormon. My grandmother, who's behind me,
Mhm,
her mother came across the plains with the pioneers,
mhm,
and went to Utah when it was not part of the United States. And the story that we were told is that they were escaping religious persecution, and so they literally had to leave the country and establish their own community.
mhm,
My dad joined the church as a young teenager, and my parents met at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and got married. And so their whole plan, obviously, was to raise their family in the church, according to the way that everybody taught you how to do it. And the expectations in the Mormon Church are that you have family prayer and scripture study at least you scripture study at least once a day, family prayer at least twice a day. You pray over every meal. Once a week, you have what's called family home evening, where you turn off the TV and you don't do any sports or outside activities. You reserve Monday night for family night, and you play games or you have a gospel discussion and you get together. Which all of this sounds so wholesome, right? It really
like
does sound
that, like
wonderful.
some of it actually doesn't sound so bad, like taking a break from screens, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, exactly. And so not only that, but church was for 3 hours on Sunday. There was the
mhm,
main meeting, which would be like your communion meeting where we take the sacrament. And then the group split up and the children go in one direction, the adults go in one direction for 2 more hours of Sunday school after that. And then twice a year, they would broadcast a general conference from Salt Lake City, and you were expected to attend as many sessions of that as you could. And it was Saturday and Sunday, 2 sessions of 2 hours each. And then this Saturday or the Friday beforehand, there was another special meeting that you could go to. And then in addition, when you're a youth, there's a youth group meeting every Wednesday night. During the summer, there's Girls Camp and Boy Scout camp. And there's so many activities, holidays and once a month and all of that stuff that all of your time gets filled up with church activities. So from the time that you're a baby, you're being exposed to all of these things. And the children start at the age of 3 in Sunday school. And so the expectation is that when you're 8 years old, you've reached what they call the age of accountability, and you're old enough to make a choice to get baptized into the church. And once you're baptized, you're a full-fledged member. You're expected to abide by all the commandments, pay your tithing, and all those things. So by the time from the age of 3 to the age of 8, with all of those meetings and prayers and everything in between, you've endured over 1,000 hours of indoctrination.
Mhm.
And at the age of 8, developmentally, what child at the age of 8 is able to make a choice that's different than the one that all of your family members have made? Every
Right.
single person in your life. It's not, I think of my own children being the age of 8 and making a huge all-encompassing life decision at that point, and we're just not capable at 8 years old to differentiate ourselves from our caregivers that much.
Mhm.
We're not psychologically able to do it. We're not physiologically able to do it. It's just, it is the
Never
purest
gonna
form
happen.
of indoctrination. And then if you add to that with my own story that I started being sexually abused at the age of 7, and
Mhm.
I received indoctrination from my abuser at that point, which somewhat conflicted with what I was being taught at church. And that indoctrination that I received at 7 almost took over in some ways, and really caused me a great deal of conflict throughout my life, because I felt like in certain situations where somebody wanted something from me physically, I didn't feel like I was allowed to say no. But the
Mm.
church was telling me that if I didn't say no and abstain from any kind of sexual contact, that I was an evil person. And they compared sexual sin, they call it the sin next to murder. And so it's like the only sin that you
It's
can
making me
commit that's
shiver.
worse than sexual sin is murdering somebody. And so you can imagine what that did to my psyche as a young adult growing up, being pressured into physically intimate situations with boyfriends or dates or whatever, and feeling
Mhm.
like my hands were off the wheel and my feet were off the brakes and there was nothing that I could do to stop it. And then feeling so guilty afterwards because I didn't fight tooth and nail to make sure that nothing happened. It was just this huge conflict of emotions that happened throughout my teenage years. And
Mhm.
when I finally was able to leave home, I left the church completely because I felt like such a terrible human being for not being able to adhere to all of the standards. And,
Mhm.
given on top of that, the shame and guilt that my parents put on me for not adhering to the standards and everything. And I just really I felt like a terrible human being altogether. And so that really was kind of the beginning of my exiting Mormonism for good, was because I felt so much better about myself when I was not in church. When I
Mhm.
left for
Mhm.
college for the first time, and I was able to see it from the outside and have a little bit of outside perspective and see it the way that other people saw it. People would make comments about the Mormon church saying how crazy the doctrine is and how weird it is that you believe these things. And,
Mhm. Mhm.
just all of the comments that other people would make about the church started my cognitive dissonance about it.
Right. One thing I wanted to ask, at what age, like, were your parents became aware of, like, the abuse that had occurred, and how did they respond to that?
It wasn't until much later into adulthood, I was well into my 30s before I told my parents about the childhood abuse I'd experienced. They
Mhm.
were, of course, horrified, and my mother especially felt so guilty for being the one who took us to the babysitter, who
Mhm.
was the
Mhm.
abuser. And, I've tried really hard to help her understand that it wasn't her fault, and that, these things can happen, and it's, it's not necessarily the parents' fault that it happened or that they didn't know. It was a lot the environment and things like that. So, I mean, my parents definitely, of course, they were horrified that that happened, but then also they have another little voice in their ear from another family member of mine trying to tell them that the abuse never happened and that I made it up. And so they have gone through phases of not believing me. The first reaction was not believing me. And, then there was a little bit more of like coming around to it. And then they got this other voice in their ear that told them it didn't happen. So they stopped believing me. It's kind of gone in these cycles, and I've had to get to the point where I understand why they don't want to believe me, because that means accepting some responsibility for not seeing the warning signs and the changes in my behavior and things like that. But also they have some loyalty to this other family member, and believing me means discrediting them. And so it's again a
Right.
fear of losing that relationship too.
No, I wonder if some of the "you're making it up" story was tied to something like, you made this up to justify your immoral behavior or something like that.
Yeah, there was some of that for sure, but also the person who is telling my parents that I made it up was one of my abusers as well. And I think that they're just trying to make sure that their own story doesn't get exposed. And
Mhm.
so that's how I reconcile that. And I understand that intellectually. I think it's terrible and horrible, of course, but there's nothing I can do about it. And,
Mhm.
just I have my own credibility. I have my own self-love and self-belief, and so that person can say whatever they want, and it doesn't affect me.
Well, I think for somebody to come out and express this is like, there is no I don't wanna say there's no benefit to it, but I mean, for somebody to make something like this up, like what you have been through and like what somebody would go through coming forward with a story like that is so costly and so difficult and so painful that this is why, I mean, especially when it comes to childhood stuff, it's like less than 2% or even less than 1% like false stories, because it's so difficult and so painful. Like, and I think at most in adulthood there's something like 7% of like false reporting.
Yeah, I think we talked about this on the last interview as well. It's less than 6% of people who come forward with sexual abuse allegations are found to be false or fraudulent.
Mhm.
When a victim tells the or makes a report to the police, that number drops down to less than 3%. And
Right.
so,
Yeah.
and I think we talked about this too. If someone is making a false report, we need to ask why. What is
Hmm.
going on with that individual that they're feeling the need to not only discredit someone else, but,
Right.
to make that report in the first place. And I think that that is the more important conversation. But what I
Mm.
continue to experience over and over is my motto is believe victims.
Mhm.
Yes, you ask questions. Yes, you get a full account and a report where you can. Yes, you ask for the details in an appropriate way. But first, you believe them. That's the
Mhm.
number one thing. And I will say that on social media, and every single time that I do, I get a litany of comments from people who say, "No, we shouldn't believe victims. They can just lie." And it's mostly, I have to say, mostly middle-aged men that make those kind of comments. But I think there's this fear out there that a lot of men have of being falsely accused of something like that. And when
It's
I Go ahead.
like, as a middle-aged man, I could tell you, like, that would be, like, that is, like, life destroying.
Yeah, of course. It can be. It
Or
definitely
or
can
or
be.
or can be. And so I think there's this overreaction to confronting the fear of, like, could you imagine what it would be like to be falsely accused? Like, literally everything I've spent my entire life building is taken away from me, and so that fear, overrides, like, understanding of the factual details that, in
Mhm.
fact, it's such a low percentage of false reporting.
Right.
And so, not to excuse the response, but I think, yeah, why would guys respond that way? And I think it would be they're just the other part of it though is that the majority, not exclusively, but the majority of abusers are male. And I think, like, excuse me, how does it make men look as a whole? Like, part of the reason why I like, or I fight for this and I want to expose this stuff is because as a man, Like, I am so frustrated and so, like, horrified by behavior that other men have committed that I do not want to be, connected and associated with that. And so I think it's so important that, and I think more men out there, more good men need to speak up and to raise their voice and to be advocates and to fight for victims. I think I might have mentioned the author of a book called Men Fight for Me. It's literally written by the executive director of an organization called Saving Innocence. And
Mhm.
it's about men being the necessary advocates because men are the primary abusers and women are the primary victims. Sometimes the roles are reversed, but the
Right.
vast majority, that's the dynamic that takes place. And it's awful and it's terrifying and it's horrifying. And we have to do everything we can to try to correct that. And so, yeah, when you when you share these stats, you get these absurd comments in and about that. And I want to say I'm sorry that it's your experience, but I think you have thick enough skin to kind of handle it. You've walked through fire to get here.
Exactly, exactly. The fire made my skin tough for sure. But yeah, I mean, it is horrible to be falsely accused. It can be life ruining, career
Mhm.
ruining as until the truth comes out,
Right.
but as a victim who has historically not been believed in some situations, I can tell you it's just as devastating to not be believed, especially
Yes.
by the people that you love and trust the most in your
Mhm.
lives.
Mhm.
So my most important thing to say to people is if somebody comes forward and tells you that they've been abused in some way, believe them first, validate
Mhm.
them first,
Mhm.
then find out what to do, to get the story and the truth told.
There's two really, really important things that you've shared here. Um, pardon me. One of them being, yes, believe first. We have to start from that place. There's been an investigator that's been looking into the abuse that's taking place in the 2 by 2 fellowship now for about 8 or 9 months, and she's went after the Catholic Church and after the Boy Scouts, and so she's well versed in in investigating this sort of stuff. And yeah, this idea that yeah, my train of thought went off the tracks, but essentially, believe first. Oh, here's what it is. She said it's actually not that difficult for a seasoned investigator to figure out when someone's false reporting. Like
Yep.
it doesn't take too many questions to figure out when something's a false report. But the other part of it is what you shared here. Don't just immediately smear them with a brush and go, "You're a terrible person." Why are they doing this? Look to
Mhm.
understand that. And it sort of calls into play here what I like to call my compassionate curiosity, looking to understand a pattern of behavior. Yes, there's the possibility there could be a nefarious pattern of behavior there, but more likely is like something else has gone wrong and this is an expression of that. And so be curious about why that might be taking place.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So to pick up, kind
Yeah,
of where
back
we
to the
left
story.
off, I did leave the church for a few years. I ended up in a series of coercive control relationships. I ended up engaged to somebody who was not a member of the church, mainly out of guilt because he was much older than I was. He told me that if this relationship didn't work out, that he was probably going to unalive himself because he felt so terrible about things. So kind of guilted me into staying in the relationship, even though I knew it wasn't what I wanted. I eventually, though, did get to the point where I came back to my faith and I thought, is this what God would want for me? Would he want me to attach myself to somebody who treats me this way? And the
Mhm.
answer was no. And I somehow found the strength to tell him, no, this is not what I want for my life. And, I ended up breaking off the engagement. And then 2 weeks later found out I was pregnant.
Mhm.
And that was the ultimate shame for my parents.
Right,
It
right.
was the ultimate shame as far as my church membership was concerned. I had to go in and confess to the bishop, and he made me read this book called The Miracle of Forgiveness, which was the sort of the Mormon textbook for repentance at the time. If you had committed any kind of sexual sin, they would give you this book and you would read it. And the problem is the person who wrote it was a former prophet of the church, the former president of the church. And he was, by reading the book, you can very clearly see that this person was extremely homophobic,
Mhm.
extremely sexually repressed, um, basically compared people who, well, he basically lumped people who have any kind of sexual, what he called sexual deviancy, lumped them all together into this horrible group where he said, if you masturbate or if you're gay, or if you have, he would say masturbation leads to homosexual behavior, and homosexual behavior leads to bestiality. And so he would lump everybody into like this same clump to where you just felt like you were a garbage human being because of this actual really natural proclivity to experiment with sexuality. And
Mhm.
so, reading that book was like it was supposed to be, it was called The Miracle of Forgiveness, but I felt after reading that like there was no hope for forgiveness. I felt like I had
Mhm.
done the worst possible things and that I was going to have to spend the rest of my life making up for it by trying to be a good Mormon.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
after I found out I was pregnant, I met another person, and to my parents, it was like, the ultimate shame for their daughter to have a baby outside of marriage. And so my idea in my brain was like, well, if I get married, then it's going to erase all of that. It'll make
Right.
it'll make
Right.
all of that right. And so I ended up in another coercive control relationship, but at least I was married. And so my baby had a quote unquote father at this point.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I decided to come back to church to try and erase all of the wrongs that I had done and try to be as good of a Mormon as I possibly could. And so I spent the next 20 years just in the most devout worship of Mormonism I possibly could be. I did literally everything that was asked of me. I took on every responsibility that I was asked to take on, even at times when I had 6 children and my husband was not helping me. He was not coming to church with me, but I was bringing my 6 children to church for 3 hours every single Sunday by myself. And I was also teaching in the church, and I was also
Mhm.
serving in other ways in the church and doing absolutely everything I could. Um, Shortly after we got married, my spouse decided to quit his job and start a business. And we had zero income for probably about 2 to 2.5 years. And we amassed a huge amount of debt. And I was taking every kind of job I could on the side to try and make money. We were on food stamps. It was just a really horrible time. But at the same time, I felt like I needed to continue having children because that was a way of being acceptable in the Mormon community. And don't get me
Mm.
wrong, I absolutely love being a mother. I love my children. I would not trade it for the world. But sometimes I wonder if I hadn't been so enmeshed in this high demand religion, if I would have chosen to have that many children that close together in a situation where we were destitute.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
just was the expectation that you have as many children as you can, even if you can't afford it, because God will provide for you kind of situation.
Mhm.
So it was a really difficult upbringing for especially my older children. There was a lot of hardship and difficulty that they went through because their dad was not a member of the church. They got, shamed and bullied and
Mhm. Mhm.
and and probably, spiritually abused because of that family situation, people knowing that your dad's not a member, so your parents weren't married in the temple, so you're kind of a second class citizen at that point.
Right. Right.
So that had to have been really, really difficult for my children. And all the while, I'm experiencing the cognitive dissonance of the way women are treated, the misogyny in
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
church, and the way that there was polygamy in the past church, and not understanding why, but being told by the apologists, well, we don't practice it anymore. It's not a part of our religion, but it's literally still in the scripture. It's still canonized doctrine.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
still something that it's a concept that is a ghost that sort of infects all of Mormonism.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what really got to it for me was, sorry, I need to plug my laptop in before the battery dies.
That's okay.
The church announced a policy where they were not going to allow children of homosexual partners to get baptized.
Mhm.
And this was right around the time of Prop 8 in California and gay marriage being legalized in a lot of different places. And the church made a decision that if your parents were gay and they were married, you were a child that was in, your parents were in a homosexual relationship, they were not going to allow that child to get baptized unless they renounced homosexuality and acknowledged that their parents were sinning, and that
Mhm.
behavior was not something that they were going to continue in their own lives. You're basically asking children um, to say that their parents were sinful people,
Mhm.
and that they weren't going to do the same thing as their parents. And to me, that was a bombshell, because I was a teacher at the time, and I had so many students who were in the LGBTQ community, and that I loved and cared about.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I would bring my kids. I was a choir teacher. I would bring my kids to church to sing at Christmas and Easter time. And how could I, as somebody who loved and cared about these people, bring them into a church that teaches that homosexuality is the sin next to murder, basically?
Mhm.
Because the Mormon church classified homosexual relationships in the same way that they classify an unmarried couple, an unmarried heterosexual couple,
Mhm.
saying that they're having sex outside of the bounds that God put out, and so therefore they're not accepted. Um, and then two of my sons ended up coming out as
Mhm.
LGBTQ. And I said, I can't affiliate myself with a church that teaches that my children are unacceptable to God.
Mhm.
And I just kept thinking, like, this is not the way Jesus would do it. He wouldn't treat people this way.
Mhm.
So that was an item that I couldn't put on my shelf because there were already too many things there.
Yeah.
And I I just remember crying and crying over that, because, I was like, well, if the church is true and this is what I've patterned my entire life after, and and you're basically telling me that if I don't believe this policy, that I can't live with God when this life is over. And I
Mhm.
got to a point where I just accepted that. I was like, okay, I guess if that's what God wants, then I guess I'm just going to have to be okay with not living with God when this life is over. And the way
Mhm.
Mormons teach about heaven is that there's like three different levels of heaven, and the highest level is reserved for people who've gone to the temple and checked all the boxes and agreed with all the doctrine. And if you don't, then you're at one of the lower levels. If you've never been a Mormon, you're at one of the lower levels, those kinds of things. And I just made my peace with it. I was like, I guess I'm going to be in the lowest level of heaven then, because,
Right. Right.
I love my people. I love my children. I love my students, and I'm not going to denounce their behavior as wrong. I think I was like, I got to this point where I was like, the church is getting it wrong about this. And I knew that the Mormon church had excluded Black people from receiving the priesthood or from attending the temple up until 1978.
Mhm.
And I believed that they got that wrong for a very long
Mhm.
time. I was like, Jesus would not have excluded anybody because
Well, he
of the
wasn't
color
white to
of
begin with.
skin. Yeah, exactly. But, Mormon
Yeah.
Jesus is white. So,
Right.
um,
Right.
but I
You
said
know.
to myself, they got it wrong with Black people in the priesthood. They're getting it wrong about LGBTQ people. It's going to take a couple hundred years for them to finally like catch up to what should be done. So that started my sort of questioning and my exiting, because I just couldn't agree with those policies. But
Mhm.
what really made my exit possible was COVID,
Mhm.
because we were not allowed to go to in-person church. I had to completely take a break from it. I started therapy, a few years prior to that, and that was where I started developing this ability to recognize unhealthy behaviors and manipulative patterns and things like that. And I started seeing it in the church. I saw it in the church culture everywhere. And
Mhm.
I had this line in my mind where I was like, okay, well, the church culture is terrible, but the doctrine is true. So I'm going to keep plugging along. And I finally did get to the space during COVID where I started to allow myself to look into the truth claims of the church,
Mhm.
because of the LGBTQ movement, and because of Black
Mhm.
Lives Matter, and because of all the things that were going on at that time. And I had attended a conference on investing for work. And
Mhm.
at the conference, we had to review a prospectus and then say whether or not we were going to invest in this thing. So I reviewed the prospectus, and the person said, "Okay, would you invest in this thing?" And I said, "Well, no, because all I have is a prospectus. The person who's asking me to invest the money has put this report together. The only information that's in here is from this person. I want to look at some outside sources and see what other people say about this company and if I should invest. I want to look at their track record. I want to look at their financial statements, all these other things. And it was sort of like this distant bell went off in my head because I had only ever read the approved materials of the church. I had been a very good Mormon and had only read correlated materials and things that were supportive of the church. I'd never looked at the other viewpoint. So COVID gave me an opportunity to start doing that because I believed that some of the things that were being taught were really harmful and started to see the manipulative patterns. And so once I started digging into the truth claims and the history of the church, I came to the realization that it makes a lot more sense that Joseph Smith, in the time period that he lived, created a doctrine that sort of fit the time period that he was in, answered some of the historical questions that people had, answered some of the theological problems that his family had with the death of his brother and some of the things that his mother was concerned about. It was just very clear looking into the actual non-whitewashed history that the entire religion was invented by Joseph Smith, that he completely made everything up, that the Book of Mormon was a work of fiction, and that the current leadership of the church actually are in possession of some documents that refute some of the truth claims of the church. But of course, they want to protect the reputation of the veracity of those claims, and so they won't allow those materials to be read by anybody. They're literally in a vault in Salt Lake City.
Right. And so you're going on both a deconstruction journey and a healing journey in parallel, which sounds like a really taxing thing to go through, because either one of those journeys can be quite psychologically and emotionally intense.
Yeah.
I guess is it accurate to say these journeys were happening with you in parallel?
Yeah, they really were happening somewhat in parallel, but by the time I got to the point where I allowed myself to examine the truth claims of the church, I had already exited 3 or 4 different abusive systems.
Right.
You
Okay.
know, I had done all this therapy work about the sex trafficking I had been involved in. I had already distanced myself from my toxic family system. I had already gotten divorced. I had quit my teaching job, which I felt was another abusive system, because teaching asks so much from us and gives so little in return. And we get so used up and maligned by the system, and we're not valued as individuals or as human beings even. When school shootings started happening more frequently, I said, like, this is ridiculous. People don't even care about the lives of students and teachers. And so I exited that as well. So by the time I got to leaving the church, I was kind of a pro at deconstructing systems. I sort of knew how to do it. And so, yes, it was devastating. Yes, I visited all of the stages of grief many times. Yes, I had an existential crisis where I was like, okay, if not this, then what? And I luckily had some really amazing resources that I was able to go to. There's a podcast called the Mormon Stories Podcast, and they do a series called Mormon Discussions, and they go through every single facet of Mormon theology from the very beginning to the very end, and they help people to understand the reality rather than the whitewashed version of it. And so I binged all 42 episodes of that podcast. They were probably, some of them were 2 or 3 hours long. I went through the course with Dr. Stephen Hassan of Exiting High Demand Religion, and that was incredibly helpful. There's also a huge ex-Mormon community on Reddit. That was actually the first thing that helped me to deconstruct, was listening to other people's stories about leaving and the things that broke their shelf and things like that. And the other thing I have to say is that leaving the church in Texas is a lot easier than leaving the church in Utah. I was already kind of separated from my family, so there was no big fallout of me telling them that I left the church. When I left, I told them, and they were like, well, it's no surprise, you were headed down this path for a long time, kind of thing. But my livelihood didn't depend on it. My social structure didn't depend on it. I had plenty of friends outside the church, and really post divorce, I had separated myself so much from the church that I was what they call physically in but mentally out. So I was attending
Right.
church, but I wasn't serving in church anymore. I wasn't teaching in church anymore. I was taking my kids, but I wasn't really, I didn't really believe anymore. So I wasn't really
Mhm.
following those things. So yeah, it was a gradual process, but it was like the end of the process was like an exponential speeding up of evolution that just, kind of everything fell away within a matter of a few months. And
Mhm. Mm.
this was really recent, actually. This happened back in February of this
Okay.
year.
Wow, wow. Okay. So that's February of 2023. Yeah, talk about exponential speed of things. And so pardon me, and then so there's that old bronchitis still showing up ever so slightly. Um, your kids have witnessed this entire journey as well, and they're all like in different age brackets, and they've watched you go through the journey of healing from the abuse that you suffered as a victim of trafficking and grooming, leaving an abusive marriage, leaving an abusive profession, leaving an abusive church. And I'm thinking, man, they've got some incredible life lessons, but that can't have been easy to even just having those conversations can't have been easy.
Yeah, definitely was not. Luckily, my oldest son was actually the first one to leave the church, and he left when he was 14.
Hmm.
And it took me another 12 years to get out after that.
Yeah.
And then one of my other daughters left the church as well. So yeah, it has been it has been, I'm sure, interesting in a lot of ways for them to witness this transformation. But throughout the whole process, ever since my divorce, I really have been very, very open with my children about everything that I've gone through, about of course, age appropriately, right?
For
The
sure. For
different
sure.
therapy things that I've gone through. But what I hope that it has taught my kids, and we have had some conversations about this, is that choosing yourself is so important, and that taking care of yourself and prioritizing your mental health is more important than pleasing someone or getting validation from any source. And
Mhm.
I think I've seen it in my children's choice of partners, companions, spouses,
Mhm.
and I've seen it in the way that they make choices about their future, their profession, the things that matter to them in their lives. And I hope that it has taught them that we all make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are really costly, and they're costly to other people. My children paid a price for being raised in that religion,
Mhm.
and to some degree are still paying that price. But the
Mhm.
faster that we can admit that we've made a mistake or that we've made a misstep, and then recover and say, okay, what do I do now? And start down that path, the better off we are. And the more that I talk to people and coach people through faith transitions, faith crisis, and things like that, the more I see that really what happens to people is they get stuck in one of the stages of grief, and they
Mhm.
get into that freeze mode, and they don't really know what to do next. And you can spend years stuck in a stage of grief without really processing it or addressing it. And we just get on autopilot, and we
Mhm.
continue to do the same things that we've always done because it feels comfortable, feels familiar to us.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it takes a great deal of willpower and courage to step away and examine things from the outside. But I think that's the most important thing that people can do.
And I think, as a coach in a different arena, but I could say the value and the importance of coaching really is somebody's not alone in this journey now. It is so, like, you become so incredibly vulnerable to go through something like this that your brain basically wants to shut down and wants you to run away back to whatever is familiar. So having somebody there who's been through it, who's been on the journey, who's walked the walk, but just someone that has your back, like when the going gets tough, is like so crucial and important. And the last thing, just before we wrap up here, I just wrote down this word de-shaming. You talked about talking about what happened to you. If we could just get rid of the shame of like being human, get rid of the shame around struggling, making mistakes, messing up, making poor choices, like get rid of that shame, because it's so important for healing and being able to move forward. And I think you've been an incredible example of that in these last number of years. And so, um, if somebody is really struggling with this, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on this process of de-shaming, and how does somebody kind of make peace with their past.
It's to me, it's more about making peace with yourself because,
Mm,
when I left the church and I finally signed the paper to remove my name from the records of the church and resign, I literally felt shame leave my body because I was no longer living in a system where I, as a human being, was unacceptable because of
mhm,
who I was. I was a divorced bisexual mother of 6 children who 4 of whom were not in the church anymore, and I was unacceptable that way.
mhm,
And the only way for me to change that was to lie to myself about who I was. And leaving the church meant stopping that lie. It
mhm,
meant stopping the betrayal of myself, ending self-betrayal, ending self-shaming. Um, Making peace with our past is about making peace with who we are and the ideas that we have about ourselves. And I've often said that it's not the trauma that damages us. It's the negative beliefs that we develop about ourselves because of the trauma. We
mm,
believe we're not in control. We believe we're not powerful. We believe we're not worthy of good treatment. And those negative beliefs, when they remain intact, are what contribute to all of the dysfunction that comes after and all of the self loathing and the self shame and the inability to recover.
mhm,
So, recovery starts with loving and accepting all of the parts of yourself, the shadow parts, as well as the parts that you deem to be acceptable and lovable. It's like, yes, there is a shadow part of myself that is a warrior, and that warrior wants to come out every single time I'm asked to trust somebody. The warrior wants to come out and say, nope, don't trust that person. Don't be vulnerable. Don't give them any of your power. And I have to just say, thank you, warrior Megan, for coming
mm,
out and protecting me from the potential of being hurt by being vulnerable. But right now, what I want to focus on is my ability to be vulnerable because that helps me
mhm,
connect. So I'm going to ask you to step away and come back out when you think I need protecting again. I love you, warrior. Thank you for being here. I love the part that you play in my life.
mm,
All the parts of ourselves deserve to be loved and accepted for the parts that they are. We need all of the parts of ourselves. And if we can learn to love and accept those things, then shame doesn't exist anymore.
mm. Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. I normally ask for words of wisdom, but I think you just absolutely nailed it. So, thank you so much for being on again. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for sharing your powerful story. And it's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for tuning into The Hidden Truth. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. It is so important that these stories are heard so that we continue to raise awareness and support victim survivors in their healing journey. For those who've been affected but haven't found your voice yet, I hope these stories inspire you to keep moving forward on your healing journey. Take care.